Okay, so thank you for joining in today. And obviously, we're looking at continuing our discussions with Learning Outcome 3 on the Unit 25 Global Business Environment. Now, in terms of just a bit of a quick recap in terms of what we covered last week, we looked at basically covering Learning Outcome 2, in which we looked at in detail a lot of different trading organizations, international and global trading organizations, which are present, and obviously how these organizations essentially look at operating, help in actually facilitating the global trade across geographies in various countries and nations. We also looked at briefly understanding the impact of international trade law, if there are any arbitrations or issues which arise, then how they can be resolved using the international trade law. And we looked at a couple of agreements like the Mercosur, the WTO, ASEAN, and a couple of others, OECD, which are different organizations which basically look at resolving some of the disputes. Two articles in particular which I'd asked you to look at was one, the Evergreen, which was the ship which basically got lodged in the Suez Canal, and then one of the other articles which I'd asked basically for you guys to look at reading to ensure that you have a good understanding of what we've discussed with regards to the various factors that we saw in terms of opportunities and challenges which the organizations can face when we talk about global economy. So there were a couple of examples in terms of the 5 dimensions that we looked at: political instability, cultural and social differences. We looked at economic disparities, and then the regulatory and legal environment. So these 4 dimensions, along with the competitive landscape, is something which the organizations need to look at when they are conducting business, globally. So the oil spill example of Shell, which happened in the Nigerian Delta, and then obviously the Evergreen ship, and how sometimes these issues, which are which can cause obviously disruption in the global supply chain, and that leads to a cascading effect in terms of prices rising on the retail shelves and outlets. And how do we see the artificial shortages being created because of disruption? And these are several challenges which organizations face, which are operating in the global environment. Now, in today's discussion, so I don't know if there were any questions or any queries from the previous discussion, but it will be good to ask them now. If there are there, then we can recollect and revisit some of the queries and then go on to Learning Outcome 3. So are there any questions or any queries on that side?
No, sir.
All right. So in general, if we look at now going into, say, for example, the bits with regards to Learning Outcome 3, here we are essentially looking at, talking into the Learning Outcome 3 is evaluating how the global, let's say, how do we operate in the global market? And the key bit that we need to look at today is basically pick up 2-3 different frameworks. So the frameworks will come across around 3 different areas. One of them tends to be what we call is the influence of culture, structure. That's the second one that we look at, and the third is functions. So these 3 bits is what we need to understand in today's learning outcome, is to look at how do we understand the influence of structure, culture, and functions of an organization if the company is operating in the global market, and how does it affect the, let's put it this way, affect the operations of the company. That is the main bit that we want to look at essentially from a point of view of studying this learning outcome. So the key 3 aspects that we are going to be focused on today would be to understand what is culture. We will look at understanding what is the structure and different structures of organizations, and then we are looking at also understanding what are the various functions that can be, seen working within the organizations. And overall, these three main factors, how do they look at, essentially, helping the organization operate and deal with, one, operate in the global market, and second, if there are issues and problems which come, then how do they look at, obviously help, and how do they come up with solutions essentially in dealing with these problems. So we'll be focused on understanding influence of structure, culture, and functions. We'll be looking at what is global market influences, and in this we will understand the McKinsey 7S structure, model of the organizational structure. We'll also look at how does the governance of an organization across geographies or boundaries, play a vital role in obviously helping the organization operate successfully across borders or, across different geographies. Here, we'll also briefly look into the role of leadership in the international context. There are lots of leadership theories. We're not going into details of leadership theories, but we are going to just, let's put it this way, do a bit of a bird's eye view in terms of why is leadership important when we look at organizations in a global context. The second most important model that we are going to be looking at is the Hofstede, cultural dimension theory. So this particular model predicts, has 6 dimensions, and we'll be looking into details of why this is important and how this model can help in understanding the cultural differences which arise when people work within organizations, and specifically organizations which have global operations. They have diverse workforce, and how does this model basically look at helping the organization understand the cultural dimensions within the organization and the power dynamics, and then how can again managers use this theoretical model to underpin and apply when we have an organization which is operating globally. And then the last context of this learning outcome is to look at, what is ethical and sustainable globalization. So over the years, what has started to happen is that a lot of companies have started to put emphasis on, sustainability, or under the concept of, ethical operations of a company. And in this case, what we are looking at generally understanding is that when we talk about, companies operating globally, they need to be looking at incorporating policies and practices which are ethical in terms of when they do trade. And then they need to be looking at sustainability in terms of anything that they are looking at producing, manufacturing. It should benefit the wider society. It should also be, let's put it this way, beneficial, not harmful to the environment, so that it allows them to do sustained operations. So this is what we are going to be focused on today, studying in terms of the learning outcome, 3. And to discuss this, we will look at a few slides that are prepared, and along with that, this slide I've also put in an article, on Moodle, which will be an additional reading for you, about 7 pages, but it's an article which has been published, as a conference paper. And it puts a good amount of focus on, understanding what is globalization and sustainability in general when we look at ethical practices with regards to sustainability and ethical practices with regards to, companies operating in the global environment. Now, in terms of key terminology, 3 things that we want to understand first, which is what is a culture, how do we define culture, and what is culture as far as, the definition of the word culture is concerned, and what is it regarding, and how do we relate it to an organization. So when we talk about culture, things like art, or, any sort of objects, or anything which is related to any sort of, let's say, beliefs and ideas that people have when we look at social behavior in terms of when you're interacting with friends, and you say, I have, this is how we do it in the family, or this is what I normally, do in this kind of a situation. So these are things which are basically over the years, evolved, and they have evolved into what are called, ideas, concepts, or your values and beliefs. And this is very particular to a particular type of people, or if you're coming from a particular geography, then it is very particular to that particular, let's say, geography or the background that you come from. And this is what we will generally say, that I come from this culture or I come from this background, and this particular bit is referring to your values, your beliefs, your attitudes, and your how would you behave within a social setup when you are interacting with different types of people, or when you are essentially, say for example, if I dress up like in my traditional costume, that will be reflective of my culture, where I come from. If I talk about certain types of laws, or for example, just to give an example, say for example, Muslims follow Sharia law. So this is a culture or a custom which they have believed in for a number of years, decades and centuries, and this reflects their background in terms of what the people, if they come from that society, would normally believe in. But without getting into, say for example, specifics, what we are looking at is the culture tends to be a set of pattern, or a set of activities, type of activities or patterns which depict how you would behave when you are in a particular social setup. Now, if we expand that definition to, say for example, what is organizational culture, what we are looking at primarily in this case is talking about the personality and character of the organization. So what are the set of values, beliefs, systems and processes which have been put in place by the management initially when the organization was formed, or when it initially started, and that would define the culture of the organization. Now, to give you an example, if in the employee handbook, the management has mentioned that we need to look at making sure that the phone calls are picked in within 4 rings. Now, this shows that the culture within the organization is very responsive, because there is the requirement of picking up the phone in 4 rings. Now, this is something which is defined in the organizational maybe the employee handbook, and making sure that everybody is able to pick up this let's say an example of a phone call which comes, then it basically shows that there is a sense of a culture wherein every customer is important, and in some cases it will also mean that the company and the culture is quite responsive. And these are things which generally are things which are ingrained within the organization when we talk about the attitude and the behavior and the standards which have been set, which make up the work environment. So a company's culture can tell you lots of things in terms of how the organization behaves, or let's say, start with what kind of individuals work within the organization, how does the recruitment process work, what do you expect in terms of attitude or behavior from an organization, and its staff in general. So if I talk about an organization which is predominantly in customer services, you would generally get to see that here most employees are trained and given regular trainings to be able to understand the customer's perspective. So they have to be polite, they have to be accurate and factual, because they cannot give information which is based on supposition or not verified by facts. And in those cases, the conversations tend to be soft, they tend to be brief, they tend to be to the point, but at the same time, the focus is on solving any problems, because the customers are reaching the organization in terms of, maybe through a call center or otherwise. So in this case, it shows how the company operates on a day-to-day basis, and what kind of culture or what kind of employees would work within, the organization. Now, there are 4 different types of cultures that we generally get to see within the organization, and they are defined as clan, adhocracy, hierarchy, and market. Now, when we talk about the 4 different types of cultures, what we are essentially focused on is understanding what and how does it, because over the years, a lot of studies have been done, and obviously these 4 models have come up. And the idea of having these 4 models is to try and understand what kind of culture is there in the organization, and if management, leadership, or people in the senior positions want to change the outfit or change the culture of the organization, the way the employees behave in the organization, what impression they give outward by behaving in that particular manner, then these are 4 broad models which are essentially, understood. Now, these models originally came in from a lot of research which was done by Robert Quinn and Kim Cameron. And this research was carried out in the US in the University of Michigan. What they did was they basically looked at investigating what makes the business effective, what makes the operations of the business, when I say is the operations of the team or a collective number of individuals effective. And from a list of 39 attributes over the years, they came across and shortlisted what are called 2 polarities, 2 key polarities. And this is something that they then projected onto a, if I bring this chart over, they projected onto what is called and plotted that onto a X and Y graph. And this then allows them to understand these 2 factors, 2 key polarities were essentially, internal and external focus and stability control versus flexibility and discretion. Now, this allowed them to come up with 4 different types of cultures, depending on the attribute each of them shows, and they categorize them into clan, adhocracy, hierarchy, and market. So if the organization is looking at more of stability and control, you would generally see the culture within the organization to be more hierarchical. But if they are leaning or market driven, now, if they are more focused on the internal side of things or operations of the organization, then you would generally see hierarchical culture. But if the company looks at globalization and has operations in many, many different locations or countries, then in that case, you would be the stability and control would be more tilting towards the external side and how do they look at creating differentiation. So these 4 types can actually be useful in understanding the type of organizational culture which can be present in a company, and it helps identify when at the time of recruitment, the HR would be able to use this particular framework to identify whether the individual will be, working with will come across with attitudes and attributes for working towards stability and control, or will be flexible and would be looking at settling into the job front, say, for example, from a point of view of, job responsibilities and, key aspects required to work within the organization. So in this case, if you're hiring a departmental head, then, there would be things that the organization can look at from a point of view of understanding whether the person would fit into the company and organizational culture, what kind of attributes and behavioral attributes they will bring in. And that would allow the company to recognize that this person would have these core values and would be able to align with the mission or vision of the company in such a way. So this particular research became quite important and obviously has been widely accepted. And the 4 different types, when we look at clan culture, adhocracy, hierarchy, and market, have certain attributes which they came up with. And these attributes, define what kind of a culture is actually present within the organization. Very briefly, there is an article on this which is put across on the plenary in the last slide, and that would basically take you to a website wherein all the detailing for these 4 different types of cultures have been done. But very briefly, a clan culture tends to be built up on or basically depicts what is related to what is called a collaborative approach. And here you would generally see the organization as a flat or let's say a flat or a flat organization in terms of a structure. The other word that I could use instead of flat is that it will have horizontal structure in the organization. That means the company is more internally oriented. It's maybe a startup or maybe does not have operations in too many locations. This is just generalizing it. And in those cases, the flexibility and discretion is normally with the head of the company or the owner or the founder of the organization. And here, the key aspects of clan culture is that communication tends to be the key in terms of making sure that everybody sings from the same songbook. And here the companies are able to implement, more or less any changes that they have to do directly from the feedback of employees. And this tends to be easier to implement because the structure of the organization tends to be flat. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages of this type. That is what is something that we can go into in detail by reading the article. Adequacy typically refers to risk-taking and innovation. So here the organizations which are startup or maybe are in a mode wherein they're expanding, they're growing, they would be more averse to risk-taking and driving innovation. And this type of model or the frame within the framework, they basically propose this model to be more outward-facing. And here the ability of the management is to allow individuals working within the organization to take more risk because they are looking at expanding, or the core focus is on employees being able to work and adapt in an environment wherein they are looking at driving innovation within the organization. Similarly, there is market culture, and market culture is focused on competition and growth. So again, external focus, it's more on stability and control because the operations of the company could be global already. So they are more focused on driving, growth for the organization. And at the same time, they are looking at, closely monitoring competition. And when we talk about hierarchical type, here the focus is on, once the organization is established, the focus is basically on structure and stability. That means the option here is to get things done right. And if we look at any global organization, they would at some stage have a hierarchical structure, even if they have multiple operations across different geographies. And the operations of the organization normally tend to be quite set and quite clearly documented. And in those cases, you would generally see, focus being on hierarchy, which is stability and control and running the operations of the company. Now, with the understanding of culture, what we also need to throw into the mix is understand, say, for example, the various types of structures that can be seen within the organization. Now, if I put it this way, various types of structures that we generally see within the organization, what we are looking at understanding here is that when we look at the way the organization is structured, that means it is organized. So if I look at putting it this way, that, sometimes when we say the organization, if I need to say, if you work within a company and you need to provide feedback to your manager, now, how many layers do you have to go through to be able to provide that feedback? Or do you have access to the top person in the organization, easily? In some cases, it goes through a process wherein, when I say process would mean you'll report it to your supervisor will report it to the manager, and the manager will discuss with the department head. So what you get to see is the layering of the way the information can be transmitted either upwards, down, or downwards. And this tends to follow a particular pattern wherein the company is organized in a way wherein certain activities are directed either from top to bottom, or in some cases within a similar layer, for example, horizontally. And that is done primarily to ensure that the goals of the organizations can be achieved. So in this case, when we talk about the organizational structure, it could include, I would say, a set of rules, activities, roles, responsibilities, whichever way you call it, and they generally would be a part and parcel of a description or a job description. And that job description would essentially tell you who you report into, what are your, if you land into any problems or issues, who do you discuss with, and how do you go about doing your day-to-day, activities, which will help in, let's say, completing goals, or completing those activities would help in achieving the goals of the organization. So a structure would determine how, for example, communication flows within the company, within different layers or levels of the company. So if I look at a memo being done by the chief executive, if it's assuming it's the start of a new financial year, you would generally see the top management of the CEO writing a memo. That memo will basically outline, say, a couple of activities that he's focused on this year. It could be turnover being increased by so much, headcount by increased by so much, margins by so much, entry into new markets. So he might, or she might, essentially the top person might set up some goals, and they would then be passed on to various departments. And then individual departments will look at contextualizing those goals and then give it or share it with employees. So there might be internal ways of communicating this, but you would generally see the flow of this information within the organization would happen in a particular way. And this flow, which you get to see of information happening within the organization, is going to be defined by the structure or how the business is actually set up. So some of us would, let's put it this way, call it a management structure. Some of us would call it a structure in the organization. And some of us would say, my structure would relate to, I report into this and I have reporting from so many different, colleagues or peers to me into for driving this particular objective. So if you're a regional sales manager, you would have area sales managers reporting into you. Under area sales managers, there'll be executive or sales people within a particular city who will be reporting into them, and that would become the structure of the sales organization. So when we look at this bit in terms of how the organization is functioning and what are the benefits and limitations of functioning in that particular fashion, which helps organize the various functions of the organization, or a company in this case, or a business in this case, you would generally see we talk about structures. Now, when we talk about structures, management, HR, and most people senior in terms of leadership team, they're always focused on optimizing the way the structure and the employees are working within the organization. If you do feel that sometimes there's a case which happens is that you have lots of redundancies. That means the organization is laying off staff. The reason why they're laying off staff is their business model has changed, and they feel, when I say the management and the leadership feel that they have too many people on front end sales, but as automation and other processes are incorporated in the organization, you may not need that many people, and that is where the organization looks at streamlining the structure by reducing the headcount, and that is related as an example of that could be related as an example to structure, of the organization. Now there are 7 or 8 different types of structures, but they all originate from the 4 basic type that we generally get to see, and they tend to be these 4 basic types, which is flat or horizontal, which is this structure here. You have matrix, you have functional, and you have divisional. Now, these words give a bit of a clue, but these are structures which we generally see in some shape or form being prevalent within most global or multinational organizations. Divisional structure would be when the company has lots of products and they're organized into, say, strategic business units or SBUs, and you would generally see that a divisionalized structure is generally found in the organization, which would go to say that, say, for example, if I have various departments and each of the departments are quite big enough, say, for example, if you look at Unilever as a company, or Procter and Gamble, or one of the examples of FMCG companies or large IT companies, you would see that they will have a divisional structure. Here, the organization is organized, or the structure, the way company works is they're organizing the company in terms of a structure by looking at key products. So if I look at Unilever, for example, soaps, oils, pastes, they would be so big categories in themselves that they would need to organize, it will be a soaps division, or this will be a perfume division, or this will be a cosmetics division, because within that structure itself, or the function of the product that they sell, there might be 50 brands that they are selling or producing, and there would be soaps. For example, if I look at, there could be 20 different soaps with Unilever itself, and they are divided into a soaps division, and that is where you'll have a CEO of that division who itself drives $5-6 billion worth of business globally. Now, if we look at functional structure, here we generally see the organization being organized, in terms of its operations from a key function point of view. So functions point of view, when you look at organizations, we look at organizations like, organizations which are specializing in, different product categories, and the customers look at the organization, or the organization in terms of buying the products and services from a point of view of what products they are buying. So if I look at an example of, say, Apple, or if I look at Microsoft, you would generally see Microsoft, is organized functionally. So for example, they have Windows as a platform, they have gaming, they have search, they have cloud, software or computing as one of the platforms, and they are organized more on the functional type of structure, wherein they will have similar types of people with similar key traits and attributes working within the organization, and that would tend to be functional. A matrix tends to be a combination of, both divisional and functional organization. So here you are going to be seeing it's a complex organization. So Microsoft would have various geographies, say, for example, Asia operations, Middle East operations, Africa operations, MENA as they call it. You have European operations and America as one, side or continent as operations. And here, product managers across, for example, Xbox, which is a gaming console that Microsoft sells, and it is sold in very many countries. So the product manager of a particular geography would report into the group head of the product manager in head office, and functionally he would be reporting into somebody within that geography as the CEO of that organization. But administratively, I mean, he would be reporting there, but functionally he works very closely with his counterpart in the head office, and that would get to see a matrix structure. Flat is very simple to define because here most of the organization is spread horizontally. It could be because of the fact that it's a startup, it's a small organization, number of employees working are less. So here maybe you have very little focus on, or let's put it this way, most of the people working with the organization are working as standalone, and in those cases they would generally report into the owner or the founder or the managing director of the company, and they would have direct access, and that is where the organization tends to have a flat structure. Now, there are lots of examples, and you can study different structures. Out of these four, we also get to see structures like network structure. We also see structures which become geographical structures or team-based structures. And there are 7, 9 or different types of structures which have, over the years come across. So, but they all originate from these 4 basic types. Now, for us, the focus is not on the structure, but the focus is on understanding what kind of, culture develops because of the structure of the organization. So structure, culture, and function are closely related. And the third part, which we want to briefly look at, is discuss about what are organizational functions. Now, when we look at, talking about organizational functions, what we are basically focused on is understanding why, the importance of structure and culture has an effect on how the functioning of the organization happens when we talk about, the day-to-day operations. So here, when we talk about the functions of the organization, this was something which was researched on by Kuntz and O'Donnell, and they basically came up after doing the research. They basically came up with what could be the most widely accepted functions which typically happen or are seen within the organization. Now, initially, when the research was done, there were 5, there were 6, 5 functions when Henry Foyle got into it in the early 1900s, but slowly and gradually, I think the model which evolved was the POLC cycle, which is the 4 broad functions which were essentially, understood to be there within the organization. So if I look at bringing this chart in, what you will generally see is that these were the 5, which was the 5 functions which mostly all organizations you'll get to see. What are the activity which the organization does? You will see that everything is organized around these 5 functions. But slowly they were bottled down into POLC. So staffing was essentially removed. So when most managers actually look at planning anything within the organization, they look at doing it in 4 different aspects. First part tends to be planning, then it tends to be, organizing, then it tends to be, talking about leading, and then last tends to be leading or directing, and then it tends to be what is called controlling. Now, these 4 functions that we talk about are important because if any company, any operations of a company that you look at, whether it's a small, medium, large corporation or a public sector enterprise, you would generally see that everything revolves around these four areas which happen within the organization. The management, the leadership, the department heads, everybody, even employees at their day-to-day level are looking at always planning. And they are planning to meet, okay, how can I approach this customer, or how can I get more customers, or how can I get more sales? It's all about planning. Then it tends to be, in most cases, if you're a department head, if you're a leader, or you're having supervisory responsibility, then in those cases, management would normally be working through a social process of involving how do we look at effective planning, which leads to helping the organization achieve its economic goals, which is more sales, more margin, more profit. And the dynamics of what we get to see across these four broad functions: planning, leading or directing, controlling, and organizing, what you get to see is essentially there is a constant readjustment which keeps happening between these four elements. And these four elements then are required to basically help the organization achieve its annual goals or quarterly goals and things like that. Now, when we look at this particular model in a bit of detail, what we are looking at primarily understanding is that this particular model would help the management separate various functions of how and what needs to happen within a company or a business. And if there is an overlapping of any of these functions, then they can use this particular model or a cycle, which is the POLC cycle: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling cycle, to be able to differentiate and divide those roles and responsibilities amongst various individuals so that the overlap is minimized. And with the overlap being minimized, what tends to happen is it leads to less conflicts, and it leads to more productivity and efficiency, because people know what they are doing. They're not stepping on somebody's toes. They are clearly responsible for what they do and how they do it. And this overall helps the organization move forward in terms of, let's say, move forward in terms of achieving goals, but also look at, let's put it this way, reducing conflicts, which we generally get to see, which can happen within the organization. Now, why functions are important? Because when we look at the function of staffing, if the organization does not recruit people having the right attributes, experience, background, skills, then they would not be putting focus on the company achieving, for example, its goals and objectives. If you are looking at hiring a sales manager, if you're looking at hiring an HR officer, if you're looking at hiring an administrator or a customer service representative, you would need to look at what are the skills they bring, their previous experience working, and how they would essentially come in and do the function within your business or your company. So in this case, this bit of, let's say, functions fall into, say, staffing. So you're looking at maybe hiring the right man for the right job. And in this case, what you're looking at is ensuring that the recruitment and selection followed by training and development tends to be in line with what the requirements of the role are. And once you have the right person, then the manager or the person to which the person will be assigned or working under would be able to direct the person to get the job done or get the work done. And that is where the company would then look at, meeting its goals and objectives. So in general, when we look at these three broad terms, which is talking about organization culture, looking at organizational structure, and looking at organizational functions, they are very important when an organization has to work across geographies. If I give you an example, we look at the example of Tesco's as an organization in the UK. It has operations in 14 different countries, but sometimes the operations of the company have to be organized in a specific way so that it is setting up a model which is going to be successful in a market. So if I look at Tesco's expanding into a market like Turkey, they understand the culture of the people which work and stay and obviously make up Turkish population. They understand what the market requirements are. And the company does, when I say understand, they do a lot of research through agencies and organizations to be able to collect this data first. What is the culture predominantly in the country, what religion, what are the demographics of the people, and what market competition are they likely to face, what are the rules and regulations from a perspective of government legislation and regulations for a company to start operations, what are the tax laws, things like that. So they'll consider a lot of these things. But if I broadly then categorize them into three different types, why they are considering this, one is they want to understand what works in the country. So they are focused on understanding the social aspect of it, and that is the culture in that location. Then we look at the legal, financial aspects of it. They are focused on understanding how the company's operations would be run. So in that case, the functions of the company would be run within that geography. And the third part they would look at would be to understand what is related to how the culture and the structure of the organization would need to be formed. So they will look at leaning into what the culture of the people is within that country, look at some of the competition, and then what they are going to do is basically look at firming up a structure of the organization. And these things would be important if Tesco as a company has to become successful by introducing its operations or expanding to a market like Turkey, because they are having to understand and readjust some of the basic bits that they follow in the UK in the head office, but obviously with different countries and different cultures and different backgrounds and different types of people working within different locations and different laws set up by the government or the law of the land in that country, they will have to readjust or let's say model some of these to make sure that the operations of the company are successful and it stays in the market from a long-term perspective, to be able to derive the benefits why they're expanding into a geography like or a nation like Turkey. So these things become very important when we talk about in general the structure, the function, and the culture of the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
Okay, now let's briefly look at a summary of just an example and as a summary of what is corporate culture. When we talk about culture within an organization, let's look at a very short video. And this video is just focused on making us understand what is the culture essentially within an organization. So let's listen into and see this particular video from a point of view of just looking at what is the culture aspect of it within the organization. So if I look at running this video, because this is an embedded video in a website. So what I want to do is look at showing you maybe a bigger window.
Culture encompasses the beliefs and behaviors that determine how a company and its employees interact with customers. Healthy culture empowers employees to view themselves as part of a team, and their work is integral to that team's success. In an unhealthy culture, employees will feel like individuals who are treated unfairly. Signs of a bad culture can include high turnover, tardiness, and indifferent or unmotivated employees. Many corporate cultures are implied rather than defined. They develop over time from the cumulative traits of its employees. Understanding why its culture works enables a corporation to hire the right people and avoid hiring the wrong ones. No two companies are the same, but things like dress code, hours, office setup, benefits, turnover, hiring practices, and client relations can define a culture. Some corporations are well known for their employee-friendly cultures. Google, for example, offers perks like telecommuting, flex time, tuition reimbursement, and free lunch, while also providing on-site services like doctor visits, laundry, massages, oil changes, and more.
So this gives you an idea, just as a very, very brief perspective of why culture is important in an organization. And today, this is a hot topic amongst most organizations, because of when we look at mental health, the well-being, we look at fitness, and we look at a work-life balance, which most organizations are trying to hit across, let's put it this way, because they have operations in different countries. And obviously, in some cases, this is becoming an important aspect because of the fact that there is a lot of stress in some functions in particular, or in some types of roles within the organization. And what organizations are trying to do is look at this aspect of well-being and wellness for their employees, and that is where they are focused on, providing perks and incentives, which generally tend to, let's say, help them attract the best talent, that would want to come in and work within the, within a company or within a business. An example of Google and, some of the other organizations, these are large scale, but even at small scale, you look at most organizations now today, in order to become and portray a friendly culture, a culture wherein there is tolerance, inclusion, there is diversity. A lot of organizations are looking at, doing small things like providing gym membership, annual dental insurance, making sure COVID obviously has taught us a lot of things. So COVID has given us flexible working hours, which has become pretty much a norm. So sometimes companies, allow people to work 3 days from the office, 2 days from home. And this is allowing tremendous productivity to happen within the companies. It is also allowing companies to realize benefits of loyalty within the employees, and turnover or leaving of employees, churn as we call it, is reducing in certain types of organizations because they've adopted these friendly practices. And this is all reflective of the culture of the organization, how tolerant the organization is, or what kind of a leadership the organization has. And this is leading into all which play into what is then putting across what is called the corporate culture, or culture within the setup. Now, let's look at one or two other key models that we want to look at before getting into specifics of, discussing, the learning outcome. Now, the first part that we get to see is that here we are focused on understanding what is McKinsey's, 7S model of the organization structure. So when we talk about McKinsey's model, this particular model was initially proposed, by McKinsey, and this came across simply because there was a need to understand, how does the organization, firm up, let's say, a strategy or a design in terms of relevant components which are important to be considered. So the 7S model, as the number 7 implies, basically are these 7 factors which are considered, or key elements, I would say, which are considered in order to effectively align and, the organization into a particular structure, and have these functions, organized in such a way that the company is able to effectively function and, achieve its goals and objectives. So it will not be wrong of me to say that when we look at Tom Peters, the person behind the development of this particular model, and because he was working in McKinsey along with some of his colleagues like Robert Walterman and Julian Phillip, they came up with this model after, studying a lot of different organizations, culture, structure, and the way they are organized in terms of carrying out their functions. And then they proposed this 7S model. What they initially did was they basically came up with the idea of that there are soft and hard side of the organization. And what they did later on was, once the two aspects were, recognized, soft and hard, they then further classified the key elements in terms of what are the softer components, or softer side of things within the organization, and what are the hard S's or the elements in the organization. And this classification that they did actually represented a connection between these 7 areas, which is divided into soft S's and hard S's. Now, these S's basically stand for structure, system, style, staff, skills, and strategy. And all of them have what are called shared values. So the key point of this model is that all these 7 elements that they identified, which make the organization work effectively, or project a particular type of culture, or have harmony amongst the functions of the organization, what the main goal of this particular model was to understand how these 7 elements or 7 attributes are aligned together, which then can help create effectiveness within the company. So why they are how they are interconnected, that is point one. Second, how if you are able to balance the interconnections in a way wherein there is a harmony between these 7 elements, then it helps the organization work and function effectively. And that is the goal of this particular study, and that is the goal which this model actually established. So when we talk about the interactions amongst these 7 different elements, they are then further classified or categorized into hard and soft functions. Hard functions being, hard elements or functions being strategy, structure, and systems. So when we talk about strategy, structure, and systems, this is the core backbone of the organization. So the company is based on a particular structure. They have a strategy to go to market, and then the management or the leadership team, they basically decide on what systems and functions are required to be able to enable this as resources for the employees to use it and then help the company go to market. And in that case, go to market would be essential, because the main aim of the company would be to provide all the resources to the employees so that they are able to help achieve the objectives of the company or the organization. The soft side of functions tend to be, including things like, style of management, staffing, skills that the staff has, and the capabilities or the competencies the staff has, and the values which the staff essentially looks at, let's say, having. So these values which the staff has, or shared values, actually come from the vision and mission of the organization. So everybody working within the company would need to understand this part, that the vision of the company is this is the mission of the organization, these are the products and services which the company takes to market, but the ultimate vision and mission of the organization is to sell this to customers, and how these products actually help in customers getting the advantage out of it or utility out of it is defined in the shared value. So the employees working within the organization need to share these objectives, understand these values and beliefs, and that would help them play an effective part within by aligning themselves and their roles with the organizational goals. Now, the most, using this particular model as a tool is basically done to ensure that the management is able to create organizational design or orient the organization in such a way that it functions effectively as a unit. So if I have 10 people in the sales, or I have 5 people in marketing, I have 3 in accounts, 2 in HR, and I have, say, for example, a number of people in operations, engineering and production and warehousing and distribution, what you're basically looking at doing is organizing the way in which these departments work, which is going to be useful and in unison for the organization. That means they're all working towards one goal, and they're all working in one direction to be able to help the organization achieve its goal. That means at the end of the day, get more customers, reach out to them for sales, ensure deliveries, and production is able to produce the goods effectively in terms of meeting the demand. And then maybe the warehousing and department side of things are essentially, allowing, this bit to happen in terms of reaching their goals. So the main bit that we want to focus on in this particular model is that the model helps the management or key people within the organization to create an organizational design or the structure in such a way, orient the organization. And when I say orient the organization, I mean the employees and staff, contractors, suppliers working in the organization in such a way that it is able to direct them to achieve the goal. Now, sometimes when we look at using this particular model, what we will look at when this particular model is to first identify what are the areas or gap areas, what are the problem areas that the organization is having. And then when the problem areas are identified, then the management will look at taking steps to isolate that problem. And that isolation of problem could happen by looking at, for example, sometimes we say, if I'll give you an example, but sometimes we would look at when I look at the problem areas could be in staffing. Maybe there is less staff. Second, the problem area could be that the staff is not very well trained, or they do not have details about, how things have to be done because the skill set is missing. So what they will do is they'll identify an area wherein there is a gap. Once the area has been identified, then the management or the person in the leadership or position or responsibility position would decide on what changes should be done or what is the course of action that needs to be taken to be able to solve that problem. Now, in order to, one is to say that, okay, training has to be done, but what the person would need to do is identify the training, the cost, the time, the budget, and then ensure that everybody goes through that training. And once staff has gone through that training, then evaluation of that would also happen to see in terms whether it is making the difference which is required to be done in terms of achievement. So there will be a continuous review which will be done to ensure that say for example, these skills are then developed in the employees. And then at some stage, what will happen is once the review is done, and if it is meeting the criteria, this cycle then would be repeated. And that would become the structure or the norm within the company or the organization. And this would be done through by tweaking these elements, which could be hard or soft elements. So sometimes the strategy might need to be changed, sometimes the structure would need to be amended, or systems would need to be bought or changed. And sometimes if the manager is not showing an effective, participative or democratic or laissez-faire style of management, then the style of how the team is being managed by a person might need to be changed, or the person might need to undergo training to understand that the organization which you were leading a couple of years back was this setup, and in that case this particular model was relevant. But now that the organization is expanded, you need to delegate, you need to ensure that you are able to give responsibilities to your employees and then monitor and review those responsibilities rather than controlling it. And that would be leading to development of maybe training for the person to understand what could be different leadership styles that could be put into practice. So skill shortages are also addressed, and this tweaking of this structure and the elements using this to tweak the structure of the organization, the functions, the way they are carried out, would help in then organizing the company and the business in such a way that it is able to move forward. And this particular model, would be essentially then useful for the company to, align its strategy overall, for example, to go to market, or in some cases, compete with competitors in the market more successfully compete with competitors in the market. And that would be the usefulness of this particular model. So these 7 factors or elements have to be aligned properly. And sometimes you would see in large organizations, this restructuring, aligning of these 7 elements or factors is done in a way to ensure that the company is effectively working or organized to be able to achieve its goals which have been set. Now, this particular model is useful, I would put it this way, in large organizations, particularly wherein we get to see divisional / matrix structure, because there is complexities in terms of number of employees, there are different number of products, the company has operation in different geographies, and each structure or each location might have a different structure. They might lean on to a particular type of culture more than what is maybe in the head office or when the organization started. And the functions of the organization may need to be organized in a particular way, which will make it more productive and more efficient within that particular location. And that is where this structure comes in quite handy. Now, there are different strategies which companies can follow. There are different goals and objectives which companies can have. And in this case, this tool can be applied, in a variety of ways to look at either looking at bringing changes into the organization, either looking at helping to implement a newer strategy in the market for the organization. It may also help the organization change and adapt to changes which are happening, in the environment, which is because of maybe products changing. For example, Nokia as a company, when it got marginalized or sidelined because companies like Nokia, BlackBerry, they did not realize that, key phones without keypad would, or touch-based interface phones would become a market reality if they are promoted and the USPs of those products are highlighted to consumers in terms of multiple functions which can be done using the phone. And as network improvements happened, the products got marginalized, and these companies basically became defunct because they were not able to align themselves or realize what changes could happen in the future. And obviously, a usefulness of this particular model would have been with the management to look at restructuring, realigning, and ensuring that the business remains more competitive and still continues to work. So this kind of a model is useful in very many different situations, even in situations like merger of organizations. So when two companies merge and they have different operations, sometimes management would need to look at which employees to retain, what skill sets to have, what is the go-to market, and in those cases, what systems to retain, and what is the overall strategy of the merger, and how the structure of the organization needs to be changed. They will again fall back into these 7 elements or factors which would need to be looked into to make the organization lean, mean, effective, and organized to be able to go to market. So this is an important theoretical framework which can be put to many usages within an organization to realign, restructure, redefine, when changes are introduced or when a new strategy is being thought of by the company in terms of new direction or products or product line being introduced, or in some cases adapting to competition and market forces, and then also looking at just generally organizing the just generally making the organization more effective. And these structural changes can be done by studying or using the McKinsey's 7S model. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No.
Okay, so let's look at how can we now implement the McKinsey's 7S structure, 7S model, when we talk about global market influences on the organization. So here, what I've done is, for example, when we look at one of the elements or one of the key aspects of the model, say, for example, if I talk about strategy and we talk about structure, systems, what we need to do is, rather than talk about theoretically about these 7 elements, we need to look at picking out areas within the organization and how would you relate it, and what could be the key areas which will be falling into these elements. So when we talk about strategy, when do you think the organization looks at evolving a strategy or developing a strategy? They would look at evolving or making a strategy is when they are facing global competition. That means they're expanding into other geographies, but there are competitors or businesses which are already selling Me Too products. So in this case, they would need to look at strategy and align the company's strategy in a way wherein it is able to successfully enter the market and also compete with the other companies or competitors which are there. When you look at global demand, when you look at global supply chain, so here we need to put on the hat of that we are working within a multinational organization or an organization which has operations across different countries. And if they have to apply this 7S model, what are the elements and what are the areas they would apply this model in? So when we talk about strategy, you could pick out things like competition, demand, and supply. When we talk about structure, we are looking at company expanding into other countries or geographies for operation, for increasing market reach. And here the focus would be on global expansion and collaboration. So when we look at expansion, we are talking about how would the company set up in terms of its structure in that particular location, what that location and how will that location or the employees within those organizations report into a particular let's say department work, and how would they report into the head office. Collaboration would here mean that sometimes you would generally see that if there are people who are specialists in launching the operations within an organization, they've expanded. So for example, if you are a business development manager, but you have experience of launching the company's business in a different city or a different location or a different country, then in some cases, sometimes the core team from the head office, because you've had that expertise and you have that experience, the core team from the head office goes and helps in setting up that operations. They will look at identifying the key people, the location, They would look at doing market research, things like that. And here, there is a bit of a collaboration that you will get to see, which happens within the head office, wherein the person goes for a time-bound period, helps the setup, and then returns back to the head office. So in this case, they'll be working within the organization, which would mean that people from different regions or different teams will come together to be able to, talk about and obviously set up operations. So that would be related to the structure side of things. If I talk about systems, the company, if they're expanding into a particular location, would need to have communication systems, reporting systems in place, and systems and equipment people would then need to have training on that, and they would essentially be the softer side of things, which the HR side or maybe the manager takes over, because structure, system, and strategy tend to be the hard components, wherein the company has little flexibility, or if they have to do and adapt to these things, there are normally major changes which have to be introduced in order to do that. So these tend to be the hard components or factors which company needs to look at from a point of view of gazing into the crystal ball from a long-term perspective, because you can't change the systems in the organization very frequently. Now, if it was let's say if it's a company which is a well-established company, so if I look at, say, for example, Samsung or LG or some of the major companies like these, if they expand into a particular country, they will need to look at maybe choosing a system which has accounting, warehousing, distribution, budgeting, forecasting, marketing, HR, everything in one place, because it's a large organization, it's entering a market, and these are basic systems which will be required for its employees to be able to work. Now, they employ, say, something like an enterprise resource planning system, an ERP, or a SAP kind of a system. And in this case, they will add additional modules as the operations of the company expands in that geography. They might just have one which is forecasting and inventory management system to begin with, but as the operations of the company expands, they will add systems which will be more useful to the operations of the company. So things like an HR system in it, and there are modules which can be added. So they will start with a software or a platform which allows for expansion, because they have operations in 190 countries. So in those cases, these systems cannot be changed, and that is why they are hard factors or components within this particular model. Now, if they choose a wrong system, lots of money, time, effort, training would need to be done again, and that would be considered a waste, because at the end of the day, they would have not anticipated that this will be required. So some of these systems come from the head office because they have tried and tested them. They know that these work, and they can be modular in the way wherein they can be expanded or contracted depending on how the company's operations are doing in that location. So when we apply the McKinsey's 7S model, they would look at systems from a point of view of global perspective, because they're already, as a company present in so many locations, and they have operations globally. Now, when we talk about soft side, so when we look at soft, elements, so here, if I put soft elements, and these are the other ones were hard elements, if I put the soft elements, they would include things like shared value, style, staff, and skills. So under shared value, if the company looks at expanding into, say, for example, the Indian market is, driven by a different culture. There are people who believe in so many different things. The market is quite fragmented. They would need to look at understanding if a company is making commercials, like an advertisement, they will need to look at regionalizing the advertisement, because if we look at India as a market, it probably has 16 national or 17 national languages, and the main language being Hindi. But because the country is vast, here they would need to produce maybe an advertisement in different vernacular mediums. So you might have a version in Hindi, you might have a version in English, you might have a version in Punjabi, or you might have a version in one of the South Indian languages like Tamil or Kannada. And that would require the company to understand the structure in a way. When I say structure, what I mean by that is the people's societal structure in such a way that it is able to get the message across to them correctly. So in those cases, shared values, cultural sensitivities, ethical standards, would need to be taken into consideration. Similarly, you look at style. a leadership style might not work in a particular location because there the labor laws are quite liberal, and or when I say liberal, I also mean they are quite advanced and developed, and the legislation is very clear from the government. So in those cases, the leadership or the person who takes up the leadership helm or takes takes charge of leading the company would also need to look at. They will also need to look at recruiting somebody locally from the geography, which would mean that they take on somebody who understands the culture of the geography or the country. They also understand what typically would work. And in this case, the person would be able to adapt and quickly settle in order to lead the organization. So these factors are on the softer side, wherein the companies have to be flexible and they have to look at recruiting people or taking on people from the local geography in order for their operations to be successful. So you would see top management when the initial setup was done, maybe were still Koreans, but over a point in time, as the company operations have established within Indian context, giving a specific example, the management has changed. Indian people have come into senior management now, diverse workforce is there. And obviously you are getting to see people also being sent across on, say, for example, deputations to other countries for them to be able to get experience. So you become an expat or a staff which is now then posted into different countries, different geographies as an incentive, as a perk, as a promotion. And that tends to happen when they look at staffing as a structure. So a lot of staff from the Indian environment, which have done quite well, have spent 15, 20 years, have been given opportunity to go and set up operation in other countries or have been made heads in other countries. And that is what is looking at staff job rotation, which tends to happen within large multinational or global organizations. And here, people within the Indian context, or say, if I look at the Chinese market, wherein there's a lot of growth happening, what you generally see that people will have more exposure to working in markets wherein they know how to drive growth, and manage customer expectations and drive company operations successfully. So people from these geographies are taken up as role models, and they are transferred to other geographies to be able to implement the same best practices, because they've garnered a skill set which generally would be only possible within a particular setup because of the diverse environment or diverse workforce, or because of the varied and deep, let's say, large operations of the organization. So here, the McKinsey 7S model could be used to enter the market, to expand the organization globally, or in some cases, tweak the structure of the organization in such a way that it understands the cultural nuances of a location or a geography in which the company works. And this helps them orient the operations in such a way that the operations are able to grow and the organization is able to effectively work by achieving its objectives. So I was reading an article a couple of days back, and that's why I put Samsung as an example here, is that Samsung entered the Indian market somewhere, I think, in the 1990s. And they started off with just a very small facility in North India, wherein they only brought in the IT products. But from 1990 onwards, if we look at the organization today in 2020 or 2023, because it was a case study, 2020, the organization has grown into operations worth 25,000 crores, which is like $2.5 billion. It is the second most strategic market outside US now for Samsung Corporation globally. It is that big. So this year, if I look at the turnover of Indian market, it's $4.5 billion. So if you look at 400 billion is what the turnover of an organization like Samsung is, and we call it a conglomerate because it has so many different types of businesses. 4.5 billion just comes from consumer electronics and FMCG goods from the Indian market, and it is the largest market for Samsung in the world. So when we look at the 7S structure, the management in the organization, which is the top management in the Indian market, is always looking at reorganizing, planning, and reorienting the structure, functions, and the staffing and the other sides of the elements within the organization. And they use the 7S structure, 7S model effectively, because there are so many operations. It is not just driven from the head office in Delhi or in Mumbai, but Samsung is now present in over 600 cities in India. And when we look at the operations of a company which is present and operating from 600 cities, which are diverse across 24 languages and 1.3 billion people, with 600 million people capable of buying their products in a market, which is the largest consumer market now for them, it is very important for them to use something like this as a structure or as a model to be able to orient the operations of a company in such a way that it allows them to function effectively, achieve its objective, and grow their operations and turnover year on year, make the profits that they want to make. Similar examples can be given for companies like Suzuki or Hyundai, which have expanded globally. You look at a lot of American corporations, you look at a lot of European companies which are expanding into Africa, Far East, the Indian subcontinent, and they are all looking at grappling with using and understanding what strategy to create, how to align systems, and what structure to create to be able to effectively work in that market. You look at Walmart, you look at lots of different large companies, Amazon, which are getting into growing markets, and they use this particular model quite effectively to, align the operations of the company with the global operations because they're expanding into a new geography. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No, sir.
Okay, let's look at briefly covering the second part, which talks about how does it affect governance when we talk about globalization for an organization. So if it's a multinational, that means it's all, do you know what is the difference between what is a multinational and what do we say when we say global and multinational? What does it mean when we say multinational companies or transnational companies, or when we say global companies? What are the difference between the three terms? Any idea? So when we say and use the word multinational, what we mean is that the company has operations in many different countries. Multinational. That means it is originated from a particular country, but now it has operations in, or it sells its goods and services in different countries. That is where we say, multinational company. Now, when we use the word transnational company, what does that mean? When we say transnational company and transnational corporation, for example, if we mention that, then what we are basically meaning by that is that in this case, the company's operations, say for example, in this case, the company's operations are still maybe in a particular location, but the operations of that company has a global reach. That means it is able to ship, it is able to operate in more than one country should a need arise. And in those cases, we would generally say that this is a transnational organization or a company which is controlled predominantly from one, location, like the headquarter, but its operations are in different countries. So initially, when we look at American organizations or Korean companies, they were all what are called transnational corporations. Reason, most of the power and most of the funding side of things or control of budgeting side of things, manufacturing was all located in Korea or, for example, in the US. And over the years, what has happened is that they've realized that because they're working in different countries, diverse cultures, they have different sets of people working, and obviously there are different regulatory and requirements available, or that they have to conform with in different countries. Slowly and gradually, and obviously liberalization policies which allowed foreign companies to own stake within the subsidiaries, their operations then slowly and gradually have transformed into what are called multinational operations. That means the power or the seat of power in terms of decision making, profitability, taxation is then centered not just in the head office, but it is also in the regional operations. And that is where these companies become multinational. So when I look at Samsung, although Samsung India Electronics Limited is a subsidiary of Samsung Corporation, but the main subsidiary when I look at Samsung SIEL is actually based in India. It is incorporated in India as a company. All the powers and in terms of major shareholding and things like that, all are concentrated within that geography. So here, any profits, any budgets, or anything in terms of what the company produces or, essentially manufactures are booked into the subsidiary in that office, which is within the Indian context. It is not transferred or siphoned off to, say, for example, the Samsung Corporation in US now, which is headquartered in US, where earlier it was Korea, Seoul. But part of it can be repatriated, but not the entire part. So in this case, the differentiation is the transnational organizations are were normally controlled by the head office in one country from where they originated. But over the years, as the policies have changed, the governments have become more liberalized, and they realize that there's more growth happening in those countries wherein, because of economic growth, companies have then set up offices and, devolved some part of the regulatory powers or the governance powers to the subsidiaries. And in those cases, these organizations have now become multinational. So when we talk about multinational, that means they have operations in different countries, but the power and the seat in terms of where they sell and produce these goods also is done in that country. And obviously they can sell to other locations from that country itself. And transnationals, I would say, were companies which were initially, like Coca-Cola and Apple and Nike and stuff. But over the years, as you see, McDonald's, for example, has branched out using a franchise model. Now it's present in so many countries. So each country has its own CEO, own setup, own, staff, and, obviously workings. But when they look at global operations, they use the economies of scale of supply chain, wherein as a big company, they're able to negotiate. So some part of that still is with the head office or the regional headquarters. So European headquarters, MENA headquarters, Middle East and Africa, or, we look at Far East. So they have become power centers as well. And that is where, we say that these organizations have transformed from being transnational companies to multinational companies because the operations are in different countries. The board, the directors, or the senior management is probably from that location. So here, when we talk about globalization, we talk about governance side of things. And here we do see that for multinational organizations, the governance structure also becomes local. So the composition of the board, because they are meeting the regulatory requirements, say, for example, environmental regulations or regulations related to import and export of goods, or regulations related to tariffs, taxes, they're all regulatory compliance, which the company is actually working with in a particular geography. And that is where the governance part of it comes into the aspect. Now, in accordance with the governance, we are also seeing now things like the ethical standards, stakeholder management, and decision-making frameworks also being localized within that particular geography. So when we talk about companies and the slogan that we talk about, going global, but going local. So when we talk about this particular slogan, whether there was an option with these companies to go global, or was there an option with the companies to go local? That means they wanted to further expand and create more product lines, and obviously look at servicing the global local geography, because there was still tremendous, growth possible within that geography. But over the years, what has become now as a slogan is that you need to go global, but think local. That means you need to be able to expand your business into international markets, but look at how you are able to better service the local customers in that market by considering their cultural requirements, their requirements in terms of for example, predominantly by looking at serving the local customers by understanding their needs and expectations, their culture, and also ensuring what customization is required to be done in their products. And one such example which I would give you is, for example, if I look at selling an iPhone in so many different markets, Apple would need to look at understanding the needs and expectation of customers in each of the market. For example, if I look at selling the iPhone in Germany, the main language set on the phone would be German, not English. There would be other options of choosing the language. I might speak German and English, or I might speak, if I'm launching it in France, I might speak French and English, or I might also speak Spanish. I have the option to choose a language pack, but the default language installed when you buy a phone and you set it up, would be default language in that country, which is, say, French or German in Germany. And in India, it might be Hindi, for example, or in Pakistan, it might be, say, for example, Urdu. But those are bits that the companies would need to consider when they look at decision making, and when we look at, going global but thinking local. So the benefits of that, which companies have realized over the years, is that with governance coming into play, that means they have to follow local legislation, they have to follow local rules set by the government, and the rules which are applicable for say compliance side of things, in terms of let's say employing people in terms of manpower. So in the UK, for example, if you have to employ somebody, you have to pay minimum wage. But these rules and regulations might not be still available in other countries, which are developing countries. But in China, you have a minimum wage, something like in most developed countries you have. And that if you have to employ somebody, you have to ensure that minimum wages are being paid. And that conforms to, for example, legislation on labor laws. Ethical standards would mean that in some cases, when governance comes in, and I gave an example that when we look at companies outsourcing manufacturing to other locations. So you look at the example of H&M, Primark, Zara, Marks and Spencer. They're outsourcing a lot of manufacturing of their clothes to countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Egypt, Philippines. But here, the ethical standards are these organizations have formed a global code. That means they will still pay minimum wage. They will make sure that the facilities which are used for manufacturing their goods and products and services are safe, and are safe from a health and safety perspective. And they then need to conform to the various health and safety standards which are introduced by the government in that location. We've seen in the past some news, and obviously heard or seen or read them in the news, that there were some fires which have happened in factories in Bangladesh, which were inhumane conditions. A lot of people and workers lost their lives, and as a result, Primark and some of the other companies which were outsourcing manufacturing then ensured that they work with the local legislators, government in that region, to ensure that when they appoint contractors, they will need to follow these ethical standards or have these minimum requirement facilities before they give business. And they then also came across, ABG as a company came across with the minimum standards that they will implement if they do outsource any operations to countries wherein the people will be given a minimum wage. They would be looking at auditing the premises of contractors to ensure health and safety is there, and they then follow what are called ethical standards. But in general, they're also conforming to the governance structure or regulations which have been introduced after such incident or mishaps have happened in certain factories, specifically in certain locations. Now, if we look at the aspect of, so one was the aspect of governance, the other is the aspect of leadership. Now, when we look at leadership, and I did mention that there are different forms of leadership theories: transactional, transformal, which are mostly 20th, 21st century concepts. But then you have autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire, and participative style of leadership, which are the four generic styles which are overall recognized. And from there, we see lots of different leadership models which have originated over the years. Now, in the international context, what we are looking at is, why is leadership important when we have a company which is, or an organization which is having multiple, which is having global operations? That means they have the operations in multiple nations or multiple geographies. So here, the leaders or people who are in leadership position need to understand and have, under very good understanding of the sensitivities of the cultural requirements and differences in various locations. And what such example that I've given, earlier, when we talk about the leadership example in an international context, is talking about, how people across different cultures and work, and how can they be made to work when a structure is to be created within an organization. What are the demands which are placed on the leadership when we talk about a particular type of custom or culture, and they are asking you to accommodate a certain, for example, let's say features and attribute in their way of working. So if I look at Japanese culture, for example, in most organizations, it is now widely accepted that employees are to be allowed to take nap while they're working after lunch. And the way companies have realized this is that it allows employees to be more productive. It allows employees to, understand that, it allows them to de-stress in a way. And over the years, what has happened is a lot of organizations have made inroads by allowing this to happen within the companies, wherein employees are allowed to take 30 to 45-minute nap after having their lunch. Now, this is showing accommodative style of leadership to look at why this particular aspect of including makes the employees more productive, makes the organization more efficient, makes the employees more loyal towards the organization, and also helps the employees to de-stress and looks at their overall well-being. Now, this is the key responsibility of leaders, to be able to understand that this is where the direction of things or changes are happening within a particular geography, and they need to be able to then accommodate and use this to be able to realize what could be the potential uses of introducing this as a practice within the organization in various places, even various geographies, and then how this would help project maybe a better image of the organization outside. So when we talk about the role of leadership in international context or international management, what we want to be able to look at is we want to ensure that the person at the top position is able to understand what is required for the organization to effectively work, and how do they retain the best talent within the organization. And that is where they would want to look at leaders in that position playing a very vital role in ensuring that they understand the requirements of the employees, and then using and understanding those requirements and the cultural sensitivities, they are able to put things into place which allows the organization to prosper. For example, if there is a focus in developed economies like Japan, Germany, UK, US, some of the bigger economies, wherein the jobs, job market are quite saturated. So people stay in their jobs, for longer durations because the markets are pretty much saturated. And when we look at this, there is a focus on continuous learning. You don't want to be losing an employee which has been working within your organization for a number of years, and because of the stagnation or no newer opportunities available, you might sometimes see that the employees leave the organization for better avenues. Now, in this case, the leadership has to recognize that if there are, let's say, fewer opportunities available, then in those cases, in order to ensure that they are able to retain the employees within the organization, they might look at focusing on continuous learning, looking at ensuring training and development happens, and the person is able to, learn more about this role. Sometimes you would see companies would also look at posting the employee to a foreign geography for a couple of months in terms of, some sort of a deputation, and that would keep the employer and the employee happy because they are helping the employee to grow their skills, maybe, expand, and also to a certain extent ensure that they are able to go into a particular location, learn from there, and then bring some of the best practices back, which then can be implemented within the organization. So leadership, when we look at in this context, tends to provide what is called new direction. And this new direction essentially helps the organization streamline and align maybe with the challenges which the organization is facing. And it is down to the leadership to be able to, kind of, let's say, identify these areas even before they become full-blown problems. So the leadership is, I'll put it this way, the leadership is actually important in this in this context, is because they are looking at they are looking at essentially identifying potential issues and problems which could arise, and their aim is to basically spot them early so that they are able to resolve these problems or look at coming up with solutions which would not pose basically mitigate these problems. So here what we are looking at is, if they are not able to identify unique differences of employees or what customers are wanting or what the stakeholder requirements are, then what will happen is that this will lead to more complex situations or issues for the business in the long run. And here the leaders are expected, when they work in global businesses or multinational organizations, they are expected to respond to these changes and spot these changes and respond to these changes which are happening in the environment. And their response to these changes helps the organization by preempting them, and then responding to them helps the organization achieve its objectives, within a particular geography. So here it is important to understand from a point of view of how governance and leadership, helps in mitigating risks and overcoming challenges within the organization, which might be coming up because of culture, diversity, structure, or various functions which are happening within the organization, and that could lead to day-to-day, or some sort of conflicts within the operations of the company as it expands within that particular location or within that, let's say, nation. An example that I would put here is that if you look at now, say, going back to Samsung, just as an example, sticking to what we've discussed today, if you look at examples of Samsung, they started operations in Noida, maybe in North India, and then slowly and gradually they've set up a factory in Chennai, they've set up a factory in Bangalore. But what they've done is, when they have expanded and set up these factories, they've also looked at various labor laws, unions, and essentially what would be the infrastructural and administrative and regulatory requirements they would need to meet. And that is why they've set up factories in certain locations from a point of view of looking at leadership, already looking into what kind of, what type of labor is available, whether it's trained manpower or not. Are there any language barriers? Does it have any infrastructural problems like transportation through road, rail or air? And is the city well connected? Are there enough manpower available from a point of view of scalability as the operations expand? Samsung, for example, has a mobile phone manufacturing factory, and they produce over 600 million phones from the Chennai factory. Then do they have enough manpower if they are looking at expanding, or would they need to move the location over a period of time? And these are strategic decisions which the management, or in this case, the leadership, has to take. And they have to look at closely following the governance structure to see how liberal are the policies from the state government, how they are able to, work and, obviously look at the labor laws. And this is all part of the leadership and governance side of managing a multinational organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Okay, let's look at briefly. I'm going to speed up slightly. Just look at briefly Hofstede's, cultural model of theory. Now, this is the second model that we want to look at in terms of, how the culture of the organization essentially, can help its operations. Now, the person's name, Gert Hofstede, he came up with this model in the 1980s. And we look at this particular model in the 1980s, what he did was he primarily focused on, understanding and examining, this particular 6 dimensions that he has come up with. But he basically did his study by conducting a large survey within the company called IBM, International Business Machines, as a computer manufacturing organization. And this study involved over 100,000 employees across 50 countries. And what he wanted to do was he divided this across 3 regions: the Americas, the European region, the Africa and Middle East, and then the Asia as one together. And what he used was certain, experimentation to understand what could be the factors which influence the culture and the working culture within the organization. So after doing his research and the surveys that he carried out, he came up with 6 dimensions, which basically are known as the 6 cultural dimensions proposed by Hofstede. And they help in understanding what kind of culture can be seen in the organization. These 6 dimensions that we talk about dimensions like power index, power distance index. It talks about individualism and collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty around avoiding index, long and short-term orientation of the company's goals, and indulgence and restraint. How much does the company want to take risks? and what are the restraints that it can exercise when we look at expanding our operations, or company looking at hiring more employees. So this bit that we talk about is the Hofstede's cultural dimension model, which he proposed, and they allow us to understand how national, regional factors can contribute to the formation of a culture within the organization. And eventually, this culture will influence the behavior of how employees work within the organization. So these 6 dimensions are defined as these, and generally, this is used by organizations to effectively understand how, if, for example, if sometimes we hear the term, there's a toxic culture in the organization. The culture in the organization is, the boss doesn't listen. It is too concentric in terms of having power with 1 or 2 people. Now, when we look at these kind of statements, what the organization in this case then tends to do is look at using this particular model to try and understand what has led to the development of this kind of a culture within the organization. And finally, this culture is emulating outwards by the behavior which the employees show within that organization. So when we talk about these 6 factors, they then correlate to certain types of, I would say, ways in which we can interpret this within the organization. So these 6 dimensions theoretically would emulate to different types of features within the organization. Let's put it this way. So when we talk about power distance index, for example, this would allow us to study what is the organizational's values and mission and visions influence within the organization, how it is set up, what is the word power, it means is that when we look at power, how is the power concentrated within the organization? Is it delegated? Is it allowing people to make decisions at various levels at the, say, for example, when we talk about the pyramid of hierarchy, we look at operational teams, we look at, middle management, and we look at the top management. So where is the power structure of the organization? Is there a hierarchy within the organization in terms of how decision-making happens? So sometimes, for example, if the company decides that I want to look at, we are looking at launching a product, and the launch budget for that product is, say, $100,000. Now, that decision-making could happen at the departmental head level, could be happening at the regional level, and could be happening at the CEO's level. So what levels at which this power is devolved, and how can this decision be taken, and how quickly can that be taken? This would be coming across to the power distance index. So if the hierarchical structure, if the structure of the organization is hierarchical, that means this decision might be layered. That means that a manager would propose a plan, it'll go to the department head, it'll talk about the usages, the advantages and the benefits, and the end result which will help achieve. But he might also not have the authority to sign off a budget of $100,000. Then it'll go to the CEO of the organization. So what you get to see is it's a hierarchical structure wherein you are generally having the top person within the organization taking a decision because it is related to financial budgeting. And that is where power distance index would be used as a dimension to understand the culture in the organization. Now, what is that going to tell you is that the culture in the organization could be autocratic or participative. Autocratic if the decision only comes from the CEO because the size of the operation or the scale of the company is such that $100,000 is a lot of money and it's a big risk. So it will come maybe from the top end only, and that could be autocratic culture or type of style of leadership. But if it is participative, that means there will be certain sanctionings of the budget which will happen over a point in time. So the manager would be able to decide that I can go in and spend, overall spending would be maybe say 100,000 across the year, but I can go in and spend 10,000. If I show the benefits, then I can go to my department head and he can sanction up to 50,000. And if it continues to show the benefit, then the further budgeting can be sanctioned by the top head, and the decision making is decentralized at the structural level. And that shows that this participative style of leadership or authority is basically delegated in terms of decision making. And that would talk about the power distance side of the index. Similarly, there are other cultural dimensions that we need to relate to. So whether the organization works on individualism or collectivism. That means here, whether there is focus on teamwork or there is focus on individual efforts. Or sometimes I'll put it this way, that when you have sales teams, you would generally see the sales teams are organized in such a way that individual sales managers would do their own contributions, and at the end of the day, company would achieve its objectives. But when it comes to rewards and incentives, if the reward and incentives given to the performer who's performed the highest in terms of obviously driving sales, then it will be more decided as that it is an individual effort to help the company reach that objective. But if the entire team gets rewarded commensurate to what they have contributed towards the achievement of the sales target, then you would generally see that the culture in that case would be collectivism. There's a focus on teams and there's focus of group. If that sales target was 10 million, but if one of the managers achieved 2.5 million and the rest 4 achieved the balance, but the highest contribution was done by one, and then the team still could not have achieved the target of 10 million if all of them had not contributed. So in those cases, the focus tends to be on collectivism. So here, individuals' influence on how various things happen within the organization, or what is the harmony amongst teams when they work together as individuals, needs to be looked at, and that would be the second dimension which you would look at, which is individualism versus collectivism. Then we have masculinity versus femininity. We have uncertainty avoidance index. That means there are things sometimes which are uncertain within the organization, even on doing certain processes, on following certain processes and practices, it's still not leading to outcomes. Then in those cases, you would generally see that there are factors which contribute to ambiguity or uncertainty in certain situations. And in those cases, you would generally see if these unusual situations are presented to employees, they will fall under what are called the uncertainty avoidance index. And this index would essentially show that there'll be a certain amount of tolerance within employees for ambiguity or unclear communication, but this will create what is called uncomfortable and comfortable situations for employees. Some of them would react and some of them would align with the organization in order to help support those goals during challenges when the organization is facing challenges. For example, during COVID, there were lots of challenges which the organization faced. So, there was uncertainty avoidance index which could have been applied, and you would generally see in some cases, the employees were put into comfortable and uncomfortable situations, and somewhere the organization's whole aim was to try and reduce these type of situations because of lockdowns and people working from home, and they tried to ensure that all the employees are prepared to face these type of challenges. But because the uncertainty was, there was a lot of uncertainty around the situation in terms of lockdowns and working within the offices. This affected the organization as a whole, and that would be termed as UAI, or an uncertainty avoidance index. And there the organization would need to look at how do we deal with this ambiguous or unfamiliar situations, and this situation in most cases should not be passed on to the employees so that it does not demotivate them or affect them from a point of view of working within the organization. And similarly, we can look at some of these dimensions like long-term versus short-term. So if we talk about long-term versus short-term, we are looking at how our organization should look at reorienting its structure, its function, and obviously the cultural model if it needs to be changed, because companies, let's face it, when they were operating in the 90s and early 2000s, had a different culture, but now the culture and this requirements from a market point of view have changed. So in those cases, you would normally look at companies being, reorienting or introducing change within the organization to ensure that, they are adapt to the current requirements in the market. Now, indulgence and restraint tends to be how much does the company look at, let's put it this way, what is the degree of freedom which it gives the employees, or what is the degree of freedom which the employees have in terms of interactions and suggestions or improving systems within the organization. So here things like your leisure time, your holidays, ensuring job rotation, for example, making sure that you have a well-being and a work-life balance would be the way the organization would look at indulgence versus restraint. And this would allow the organization to have a conducive culture, which would mean that employees, when they work generally within the organization, they feel that they are not under stress and they are relaxed, and they are able to carry out their usual duties and functions in a very cordial and a usual substantial manner. Now, what this model helps us do is basically help us understand how within the organizations, when they become global, the management can use this model to tailor some of the management practices to suit the requirement of operations in a particular country. It helps them develop effective communication strategies, which would resonate with the employees and also with local stakeholders. That means people who are contractors, suppliers, partners working with the company or the organization in terms of supplying goods and services. And then it helps the organization make better decisions on the softer side of things, which is to look at skills, look at staffing, and look at the softer elements which are basically required for the functioning of the organization. So in this case, it is quite useful for the organization because it helps the organization understand what kind of culture is being created when the employees working in a particular location. And if they need to reorient or change some of these things, then they would adjust using the 6 dimensions available in the Hofstede's model of cultural dimensions. Is that okay? Any questions on this? Right, let's do the discussion on the last part, which is touching on briefly the ethical and sustainable globalization aspects of when we talk about global business. Now here, this part of it refers to the international integration of the business in terms if the business is producing goods, and then say, for example, in a particular geography, but the raw material and the goods are coming across from different locations. For example, going back to Marks and Spencer, Primark and Zara, some part of the clothes and the basic bits of it comes from the Indian and the Egyptian market of the Egyptian cotton, or say, for example, if the Marks and Spencer is manufacturing shirts, they come from this geography. The raw material is then sent to Vietnam or Bangladesh or China, wherein in large manufacturing facilities that they have, they would produce the finished goods, which will then be shipped or transported across to different countries, wherein it sells these products. Now, in order to ensure that they have ethical operations, that means they are paying fair price to the cotton traders or cotton farmers. They are essentially then paying a fair price to people who are employed within the manufacturing facilities, and then they are able to put some part of the profits back into the local society in order to help in the development of communities, and obviously giving back something to the environment, ensuring that if there are any resources being utilized locally, then they are spending, or at least part of the profits are going back to repatriate those resources in that geography, so that people and generations could, as we normally say, that the future generations could make use of it. They would be considered as ethical operations, from a business perspective for that organization. And when we look at sustainable practices, what we are looking at is the company looking at using or putting processes in place which will allow its operation in that geography to be sustainable. That means they are doing waste management, disposal of waste, for example, not harming the environment, looking at ways in which they can use less of natural resources, things like water, or using and introducing, environmentally friendly policies. For example, the use of equipment is more energy efficient, or it is not leading to a large carbon footprint in that location. And they would mean that the company is employing what is called, sustainable practices while still producing goods locally in that particular market. And when we talk about ethical and sustainable, sustainable operations from a company standpoint of view, we look at economic impact, we look at the social impact, which is societal impact, or how much is the organization able to give back to the community, environmental impact, and then how is it having an impact on the consumer behavior, and then how is it dealing with political and regulatory requirements or, compliances on that side while producing goods for its global operations. So sometimes governments would work, with the companies to be able to produce or work on certain type of laws, which will make it much more conducive for them to be able to hire people or fire people, or obviously, start operations in a particular geography. And in some countries, governments, if they attract business as foreign direct investment, they would normally give out soaps or tax relief or benefits to the companies for a number of years, because the company looks at creating, when it starts an operation in a particular geography, it looks at creating employment opportunities. It benefits the local community in terms of uplifting the community and providing, wider avenues of revenue or, let's say, growth in terms of money creation. And that allows the companies to use sustainable methods to be able to start up operations or set up operations in that location. But at the same time, they have to conform with laws, legislations. They have to look at societal impact. They have to look at environmental impact. They have to look at economic impact, whether it's going to be profitable in the long run or not. And those are considerations which the organizations have to look at when we talk about the influence of ethical and sustainable operations, for the organization, which is basically having global operations. Now, with this, it brings us to an end of the discussion on Learning Outcome 3. But what I would want you to do is obviously look at reading some of the additional articles, which I think are going to be quite useful for you to, let's put it this way, put a bit more knowledge in terms of what we have discussed today, from a point of view of this learning outcome, which is looking at how companies operate within a global market, and they are influenced by culture, structure, and functions as three broad parameters from an aspect of their global operations. So what I would suggest is that there are a number of articles that I mentioned, here, and they are going to be useful reading from a point of view of, for our learning outcome today. So what I would want to briefly show you is these, which I put up here. And this is something that I would suggest that you should read by clicking onto these links. So let me just switch you over to, the browser. And that would give you a clear understanding of some of the content that could be useful for you for additional reading. So one of the first articles that I would suggest is the 4 types of, culture, organization culture. And this is very nicely defined, in this particular reading. It will take about 15-20 minutes for you to be able to read, and this link is on the presentation. The second one is the McKinsey 7S model. This is from a website called Smarter Insights, and it provides a very concise way of understanding this particular model. And there's an implementation example of this also model given when we look at how companies use this typically for their international operations. The next article which I have is, if you want to go into details of the organizational structures, various types, and how they are set up, and what would be the structure with examples in different types of organizations, this particular website presents very good example of, what are the various types of structures that you can look at. And last but not the least, there's an article from Harvard Business Review, which is Globalization of Markets. This overall gives you a very good perspective of this learning outcome. So when a company looks at expanding globally or expanding operations into international geographies, they would need to consider structure, culture, and functions. And this article would put emphasis on how the companies are looking at taking this into account with the modern perspective of some of the underpinning of theory, that is the 7S model and the Hofstede model that we've discussed will essentially be something that you'll be able to get to read in this. So these 4 websites, the organizational culture, the 7S model, the organizational structures, and an overall article on globalization of markets is something that I put across here, on the PowerPoint, which I think would be good additional reading for you to, crystallize this particular and understand this particular learning outcome. Is that okay? Any questions on today's session?
No, sir.
Any questions at your end, Ishika?
No, sir.
Okay, good stuff. So we'll catch up tomorrow to discuss Learning Outcome 4. Till then, this presentation and a handout and these links are all available on the Moodle. So my session would be, I'll catch up with you same time tomorrow, and I'll get the Learning Outcome 4 presentation also uploaded later today, which will allow you to read into what we are going to discuss tomorrow, which is tomorrow's discussion is going to be on doing it. So we need to be able to develop a global strategy to support decision making for a given organization. So we'll need to take up an example in terms of our discussion, how whatever we have learned in Learning Outcome 1, 2, and 3 is now what we are going to put into a plan, which is a global strategy plan that will be created. And that is what we'll discuss in Learning Outcome 4 tomorrow. So till then, thank you so much for joining, and I will see you guys tomorrow.